Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade, where the Imperium has received the miracle it was hoping for. And in the most literal sense as well, in the shape of Saintess Sabbat reborn, ready to lead the reconquest of her worlds in the God Emperor's name. The news alone was enough to turn entire battlefronts on their heads, where the Imperium had previously been on a failing front. Stricken deeply by the enemy's terror tactics, now ever more resolute resistance was growing forth everywhere that her name was mentioned. It was a precious reprieve for the War Master's overstretched crusade, as stiffening Imperial Guard resistance slowed down the twin jaws of the Gaur, Magisters Anaquana Sec and Enoch Innocenti. But not everything was going the War Master's way. The joyous news of the Saints' return was somewhat besmirched by two nigglingly uncomfortable data points. The first was that the Saintess Reborn had been discovered by a disgraced general, kept in the rearward lines on simple occupation duty on the world of Hagia, the Saints' original home world. This general was Lugo, the man who had almost managed to end Ibrahim Gaunt's career. But far more damningly in the eyes of the War Master, Lugo's decision to withdraw his troops and his Imperial Navy elements from Hagia when it became apparent that a major Chaos force was headed towards it had very nearly doomed the entire Imperial Crusade. Now granted, at the time Lugo had not yet known of the two other jaws closing around the Imperium's neck, but had this third jaw also managed to snap shut along with the other two, the Crusade would probably already have been over. In such a situation, Lugo's decision should have been to stand and fight, regardless of the odds, to give the Crusade a chance to survive. But Lugo had of course elected to save his own skin. This, far more so than the slight against Ibrahim Gaunt, was the main reason why Lugo had been reassigned to inglorious garrison duty. Unfortunately, this had also, as it happened, placed him in the perfect position to take advantage of the Saints' miraculous return. This stroke of fortune also made many initially doubt the veracity of the rumors. General Lugo had always been a career-oriented individual and had taken his de facto demotion very poorly indeed. He had also been known to be the kind of guy to bend the rules when it benefited him. Would even he be so bold as brass as to fake the return of the Saint, merely to get himself back into the good graces of his superiors? Blasphemous though such a thing might be, there were quite a few who thought that was exactly what the disgraced general was doing. However, political ploy or not, reality remained. The rumor of the Saints' return had galvanized the Imperial Crusade, and Makaroth was more than savvy enough a political player himself to understand that any efforts to reveal a falsehood, if indeed it was so, would do far more damage than good. For better or worse, Lugo's star was yet again in the ascendancy, although it was also clear that Lugo had not got complete control over his new icon. The second problem, you see, was that the saint had categorically refused instructions from the front line, and, reports indicated, from Lugo himself as well. The puppet had a mind of its own. Whilst Makaroth desired the saint delivered to the front line at the earliest convenience, both to bolster morale and to be able to pry her away from Lugo, something that Lugo himself also desired. Not the second part, mind you, but a reassignment to the front was exactly what he wanted. And he was probably convinced that once he arrived there, he could reach an understanding with Makaroth, where he would be given preferential treatment in command matters in return for handing over the reins of his newfound miracle. Reins that might only exist in Lugo's head, that is, as the saint herself insisted on going to a relatively insignificant world by the name of Herodor. Laying along the southern extreme edges of the system, Herodor was the very definition of insignificant. It was not possessed of great natural resources, it had very little, if any, nor was it a major production hub or a population center. Indeed, it had practically only one major city, nor was it of any immediate strategic significance, laying far out of the way of the currently roiling battleground, where the twin jaws of the Gaur were attempting to cut the Imperium's throat. The only significance the world was possessed of was the city of the Civitas Beati and its sacred spring, where the saint had rested during her initial conquest of the Sabbat worlds, and where she healed grievous wounds. But, despite the seeming absurdity of the desire to go to Herodor, Lugo could not deny the saint's request, for it is not a humble Lord General's position to question the words of a living saint, right? And if one therefore was to do so, it would cause serious damage to her image. And Lugo didn't want that. And so, the saint got her way, and off to Hagia the Lord General and his saint went, along with an interesting request. The saint had requested the presence of the Tanith first and only, asking for Ibrahim Gaunt by name. This was someone, of course, that Lugo knew. Someone that Lugo had placed considerable political capital in destroying, and someone he had failed to destroy. But for his many failings, Lugo was not an idiot. He had gotten a decent grasp of Ibrahim Gaunt's character, and figured he could probably point him in the correct direction. And if not, at the very least, Lugo's aim to have the saint head for Moorland would probably align with Gaunt's aims as well. And so the saint would have her honor guard. A guard that arrived slightly confused, having been called across a significant distance of space and from a currently active and important front line to, many of them suspected, play babysitter. At least the Tanith wouldn't be left entirely unentertained, as along with the saint had come, firstly, enormous numbers of pilgrims, massively overwhelming the Civitas' ability to actually handle or care for even a fraction of them, and along with the pilgrims came heretics in tremendous numbers. The first was an unavoidable inconvenience, coming in huge personnel carriers, with civilians being unloaded by the tens of thousands, people who had come from across the Sabbat worlds to be closer to their saint. And the second were a far more strident problem, Often arriving in the same transport, heretics, chaos cultists, and various dissidents and infiltrators arrived not in quite the same numbers, but in large enough to be a problem for local PDF and the Civitas militia. Already there had been countless raids upon the massed pilgrim encampments that were by now sprawling far outside of the city's limits. It was during what appeared to be a raid by heretical dissidents that the Tarnith first and only arrived, with Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt doing what he always does when he arrives in a new planet: antagonize local leadership. Meanwhile, some of his commanders had decided to go rogue, in a minor way, but rogue nevertheless. Gaunt's second-in-command, Coram Corbeck, had taken several of the landers designated to bring the Tarnith First and Only down to the surface of the world and reroute them mid-descent. Along with Ron, McCall, and Organ Sorek, they had received reports of the raid being launched by heretical cultists against the outskirts of the Civitas, and had, as Radioman Beltane put it, elected to muck in. Literal words he relayed to Colonel Commissar Gaunt later on when he wondered where 4 of his transports had gone. And they would soon have plenty to muck in against. Whilst the PDF and Civitas militia had dealt well enough with the occasional raid of chaos cultists, drawn as unwaveringly to the saint as her countless pilgrims, they were now up against something significantly more dangerous, as the raid was supported by stock tanks and disciplined infantry, wearing red body armor and iron grotesques. These were not your average run-of-the-mill heretics. This were the elite troopers of chaos. The Blood Pact had come to Herodor. I suppose it was too much to hope for that the Saints' return would go unnoticed by the arch-enemy. And unlike many in the Imperial camp, there appeared to be very little doubt as to the authenticity of this miracle amongst chaos. And largely derived of heavy weapons, the Civitas militia would have struggled to contain even this small probing maneuver were it not for the timely intervention of the Tarnith First and Only. Hardly a regiment overblessed with heavy weaponry either, but they did carry plenty of the shoulder-mounted rocket launchers that they affectionately called tread feathers. More than enough to deal with some light stock tanks. But whilst the raid was seen off without too much of a problem, the nature of the forces involved were very worrying indeed. Blood Pact troops were not simple raiders. They were not dispatched in these small numbers just to harass the outer layers of local PDF defenses. They signaled that there was a far larger chaos commitment to the war on Herodor than anyone had expected. Indeed, no one had really seemingly thought that chaos would make a major effort against the Saint, at the very least not on a strategic level, and yet here was the Blood Pact, the enemy's elites drawn away from the front line to a insignificant world to hunt a girl. And a girl it may very well be, as Ibrahim Gaunt received an audience with the Saint and immediately recognized her as the girl Sarnian from his adventures on Hagia. She was the young Isholai that had accompanied Bryn Milo and the other wounded invalids in their efforts to rejoin Gaunt and the Honor Guard as they moved their way towards the Saint's final resting place. And she was therefore partially responsible for the salvation of the entire planet, due to the triggering of the, Deus Ex Machina underneath the mountain. Apparently, the young girl had made good on her promise to join the Imperial Guard, as she had decided that the only universal truth, the only absolute in the Imperium now and then, was violence. It was force and martial might. Certainly a fiery disposition worthy of a saint, and it was probably what brought her to Lord General Lugo's attention in the first place, whom, upon seeing this ferociously fanatic young girl, hailing of course from Hagia, the saint's home planet, and thought to himself that this would make a pretty little banner indeed. She did not, however, fool Gaunt, who declared her to not be his saint upon meeting her, but he also realized the strategic implications of denouncing her publicly, and so he simply told Lugo that it did not matter if he believed she was the saint. Her importance to the Crusade was too great. Lugo simply responded by saying, "Now you're starting to get it, Gaunt." And with no other real choice, Gaunt simply had to get going with it, and begin preparing the defenses of the Civitas Beati. The immediate objective, as far as the Civitas leadership was concerned, was to keep the city and as much of the pilgrim population as possible safe against further chaos raiders, heretic insurgents. Gaunt's estimation of the situation was somewhat more pessimistic. The arrival of the Blood Pact, even though they be in small numbers from their first probing attack, indicated to Gaunt that this was something significantly more serious than the occasional band of heretics who had infiltrated alongside the countless pilgrims in a desperate effort to stop what they clearly viewed as the resurrection of the Beati. Gaunt had no real proof as of yet, beyond the simple presence of Blood Pact forces, but he suspected a major force were probably somewhere out there on Herodor, preparing for God Emperor only knows what. But as it was still possible that these had simply been the scattered remnants of some battle or other that had snuck onto the planet, the Civitas commanders did not give too much credibility to Gaunt's worries as of yet. And if all the city needed to deal with were the occasional insurrectionist formation or a handful of Blood Pact, then the situation was looking fairly good. Herodor was not a major planet by any stretch of the imagination, but it had a PDF. It also possessed a local militia. Combined, the two numbered some 12,000 men, along with medium, mostly locally produced armor. In addition to this came 1,000 members of the Lord General's personal honor guard. They were many cuts above the local PDF and militia. Luxuriously equipped with heavy and special weaponry, along with their own transports and armor, this formation could comfortably be relied upon to punch well above its numerical weight. And then finally, of course, came the Tarnith themselves. The exact size of the regiment at this point in time is a bit difficult to determine. Documents from the time suggest that there were 19 platoons active in patrolling and erecting defenses on the outskirts of the Civitas shortly after the regiment's arrival, but this probably was no more than roughly half of the Tarnith's total strength. As if they were reduced to a mere 19 platoons, then even a generous estimate would place them at less than 1,000 men. More likely, they were still in excess of 2,000, possibly even 3, although the trials and tribulations of ex-Cardinal would no doubt have trimmed their numbers somewhat. So, at the greatest estimate, the defenders numbered some 16,000. 3,000 of which would be the professional members of the Tanith First and Only. Another 1,000 would be the Lord General's personal guard, elite troopers by all estimates. And the remaining 12,000 would be of highly varying quality. The Civitas Beati maintained an elite nucleus core of well-equipped and trained local PDF, but the militia, well-armed and presumably eager amateurs, but little else. It was a formidable force if all they were expected to deal with were insurgents, but more than a little thin if it was supposed to face off against an entire Chaos army. It was fortunate then that things in orbit were looking better. The War Master had sent a significant honor guard of his own to guide Lord General Lugo and the Saint wherever they might wish to go. This was the battleship Omnia Vincit, along with the escorting frigates, the Navarre, and the Berengaria. These ships were then joined by the Laudate Divinitatis heavy cruiser and another frigate, the Glory of Cadia, as they escorted the Tanith First and Only's transport ships to Herodor. Under the command now of Captain Esquine, this was a significant escort detail and a luxurious orbital defense, even though its ability to maneuver and deploy were currently being hampered by the dozens and dozens of pilgrim ships also in orbit, thronging up against one another in an effort to reach stable orbit and begin disgorging their masses of pilgrim passengers. The traffic was proving challenging in other ways as well. The usual auger relays capable of reading the currents of the warp to provide early warning of incoming translations, hardly a precise science at the best of times, was practically blind due to the quantity of ships coming and going from Herodor. So churned up was the warp that the fleet was reduced to making, at best, rough guesses at the tonnage of incoming ships by measuring their bow wave through the warp. They might as well have been using tarot card for all of the accuracy involved in such a procedure, but it was at least better than nothing. And they knew that one of the incoming fleets was an Imperial one, as previous astro-telepathic communication had confirmed that significant fleet reinforcements were vectoring towards Herodor. 5 further warships and a carrier, which when joined with Fleet Master Equine's already existing forces would make Herodor a very tough nut to crack for anything but a dedicated Chaos flotilla. And regardless of how churned up the warp might be, if a fleet of that size started moving towards Herodor, the Imperial fleet would receive enough warning to get the Saint back on board and make emergency translations of their own, should it prove so vast that fighting was not an option. And that was not the only good news. Lugo had also received word that 3 regiments of Khan heavy infantry were heading towards him, along with an armored company and Adeptus Mechanicus specialists, with ships carrying new plasma generators to beef up the shields of the Civitas Beati. Clearly, the War Master was taking the Saints' security very seriously, and soon Herodor would be almost as tough a nut to crack as most of the frontline battlefields. But these reinforcements were still a few days away, and until then, the city and its defenders would need to hold out against the heretic insurgents, and they would need to do so without one of their principal weapons in such close-quarters engagements. The Tanith had been refused to bring any of their flamethrowers along with them into the city. The venerable flamethrower was one of the few heavy weapons the Tarnith possessed in decent quantities, and their use were denied because they were perceived to be a weapon of honor, only to be used by the Civitas' elite defenders. This was because water was an extremely precious resource on Herodor, and so the only ones who could be entrusted with the power and responsibility of wielding water's enemy, fire, were those of sufficient standing and birth. It genuinely amazes me that Gaunt actually listened to this instruction for once. This sounds like exactly the kind of local lunacy he would usually ignore. But the Tarnith were deployed to the front lines without their beloved Prometheum belchers, and they would soon get involved in some action, as the heretic dissidents, the raiders and the insurrectionists returned in significantly larger numbers, still wearing iron grotesques, wielding laser guns and supported by stock tanks. Repeated requests from the Tarnith to redesignate these insurrectionists as what they actually were, an invading advance force of blood-packed professional military troops, well, all requests fell on deaf ears, and the Tarnith were largely left to fend for themselves against ever-increasing numbers of blood-packed invaders. This was a significant escalade, not merely a probing push or a terror attack, as the Tarnith were being reliably informed on their long-range voxcasters by Civitas Beati command, but a probe into the Imperial's defenses. And of course, the only need there ever is to probe something is if you're looking for somewhere to hit with a lot more force than you're currently pushing with. The combat was exhausting and heavy, but the Tarnith were holding on well enough, despite their lack of flamethrowers, until an inexplicable sense of depression, loss, and hopelessness descended across all the Imperial forces, civilians and soldiers alike. Sure, the blood-packed assault had been ferocious, but nothing unusually so, and they were suddenly gaining far more ground, largely because the defenders were giving up, almost, retreating without a fight, as if their entire existence on the world had suddenly become pointless. There was, for a moment, a real, genuine threat that this mere Chaos probe would break through the outer ring of defenses held by the Tarnith, who were quickly crumbling, and instead the Chaos forces would push directly into the Civitas Beati itself. A catastrophic outcome of such an early, light assault. It was only when Lord General Lugo mobilized the city's reserves and also threw his own lifeguard into a counter-assault that the situation finally became stable again, and the Blood-Pact were driven into the wastes outside the city by the lifeguard spearheading the Civitas PDF and militia forces, along with the Saint herself. In fact, the Saint became a rallying symbol for the defenders, stood as she was on the back of an open-topped salamander transport, a huge light projection of a double-headed eagle stretching out behind her. She became the living embodiment of the Imperium's will to resist, a walking, talking, slashing banner around whom the defenders could rally, and without whom the Tarnith may very well have collapsed, at least in this portion of the Civitas. Which was of course weird, because Gaunt had previously concluded that this was not the Saint, that Sarnian was in fact a fake, someone propped up by Lord General Lugo for no other reason than to advance his own career. This wasn't the first time Gaunt would be wrong today, as when Lugo mobilized the counterattack, Gaunt also cursed him for doing so, complaining vehemently later that this would expose the city. What if there had been other equivalent-sized blood-packed formations sitting in wait, ready to strike at the other areas of the city? Oh, well, golly gosh, I don't know. If 2 or 3 equivalent forces to the one already routing the Tarnis were about to attack, well, shit. I feel as if the reserves would have been somewhat pointless anyways. If you're already losing so badly that the city itself is under threat, then, well, that is kind of the moment when you throw in the reserves, and if that still isn't enough, tough shit, I do suppose. But this is where we are going to do a little bit of a interjection here from an inquisitorial point of view, because a fair few interesting things were also happening. You see, previously on Herodor, there had been several reports of miracles, on a small scale, granted, but unusual events. On one occasion, for example, a young girl, a child in essence, had supposedly stood up to an angry mob and brought them all to quiescent compliance merely with her raised hands. Unusual. There were other reports during the fighting as well that this young girl had appeared out of nowhere, that she had guided refugees to safety. There were many such accounts, but they all stopped abruptly during the fighting, with some claiming to have seen the miracle girl be blown apart by a tank shell. It was around this time as well that the mysterious sense of defeat settled upon the Imperial defenders. Later statements said that they felt as if something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong, as if the universe itself had somehow failed. This might be understandable amongst those men who had seen this young girl obliterated by a high-explosive shell, as they, well, might have been distressed by the sight, the pointlessness of it all, and the brutality of the enemy. But they were far from the only ones to experience it. This phenomenon manifested across the entirety of the battle zone, simultaneously, even amongst Tarnith troopers who were nowhere near the event. A mysterious happenstance indeed, seemingly only explainable by some sort of psychic interference. The enemy had been known to widely utilize terror tactics on many other Imperial worlds. Anaquanar Sek, on the opposite side of this offensive, had himself created quite the calling card for terror tactics. Innocenti, too, was certainly not a slouch in their application, although this was on an entirely different level of complexity. A psychic attack large enough to cover an entire city, yet subtle enough to not be detected by any of the astropaths within the Civitas Beati. It seems unlikely that the arch-enemy would be able to wield weapons of such subtlety and effect, and if they were able to do so, it seems even more unlikely that they wouldn't have done so far more often. Could it have emerged from the Imperial side then? Well, there was another source of psychic disturbance on the planet at the time, one that would become quite a well-held secret for multiple reasons that we will delve into later on in this series. But for the moment, there are inquisitorial papers pertaining to a man by the name of Organ Sorek. He had been a smelter boss on Vervanhive, and had joined up with the Tarnith first and only during Warmaster Makaroth's offer for those who wished to do so to join the Imperial Guard. Organ Sorek had, like so many others, elected to serve alongside the people's hero Ibrahim Gaunt. and Sorik had proven himself a born leader, both in the Scratch companies during the war on Vervon Hive, and later within the Tarnith, where he became one of the most respected officers from the Vervon Hive influx. He was also known for a particularly sharp intuition, which had first manifested during the war on Fantine, where he saved Colm Corbec's life by informing the Tarnith chief medic, one Dordan, that there were demons hiding within Colm Corbec's bloodstream, little monsters gnawing away at him and causing him to fade. Dordan had apparently not decided to analyze Colm Corbec's blood for some reason, and upon doing so did indeed find a blood infection, which was killing the Tarnith's second-in-command. Due to Sorik's observations, Colm Corbec lived to fight another day. He was also said to have admitted to a strange family history as well during the war. He claimed that one of his relatives was a witch, a woman with the sight, and apparently he, being the seventh son of the seventh son, was supposed to have inherited the same talent, but he had never experienced so much as a twinge of unusual powers, and he certainly wasn't able to see the future, despite current indications to the contrary. And later on, during the war on X, Cardinal Organ Sorik started receiving messages, specifically written messages. He would find a small brass messenger capsule inside of his pocket. Once he withdrew it and opened it, he would find inside a slip of paper. Upon it was written instructions, information, secrets that none could possibly know, and they were written in his handwriting. Curious. I'm sure I don't have to point this out, but this is not exactly standard. Unfortunately, the Imperial Guard has yet to develop prophetic messenger shells, and Orgon Sorik, of course, knew this, but for the time being, all of his messages appeared to be beneficial. They warned him of when a shelling would descend upon the front line that he was occupying during the war on Ex-Cardinal. It warned him of incoming raids. It alerted him to when somebody would suddenly show up at his billet, threatening to reveal his little secret. For whilst Orgon Sorik himself was completely convinced that this was obviously a good thing, it was helping him, it was keeping his men safe, it was revealing to him the exact location of enemy weapons team, for God Emperor's sake. How could this be anything but a boon? But he retained enough grasp of reality to understand that the God Emperor's most favored servants in the Inquisition might not share his interpretation of the situation. Thus he went to great lengths to hide his little messenger shell. His ruse was not as successful as he thought, however, as it quickly became common knowledge amongst the men under his command that Orgon Sorik had a lucky charm. A little brass shell in his pocket that would warn him of bad events. They thought nothing more of it, being simple Imperial Guard soldiers. They probably thought it was some sort of God Emperor sent blessing. You know, it's almost disturbing how often this repeats. It's a trend amongst those who toy a bit too much with the darker side to view their brand new set of extraordinarily spiked appendages at first as a blessing from the Emperor, rather than the more likely source. In the case of Orgon Sorik, however, his powers appeared to be entirely benign. There were no instances of his little messaging shell leading him or his men astray. and it would indeed become rather pivotal later on. But despite these clearly unnatural events, there is nothing to suggest that Orgon Sorik was involved in the psychic event that caused the Tarnith to lose their stomach for fighting. There is, however, yet another weird miracle that occurred shortly after the fighting finished. After the appearance of Sarnian, or the Saint, depending upon whom you asked, the Imperials rallied and drove back the Chaos Probe, but the Tarnith First and Only had taken quite a battering whilst doing so. And one of the casualties was a man by the name of McKenna. McKenna was one of the Tarnith elite scouts, and his loss would affect the regiment deeply. However, he was not dead, merely on death's door, heavily wounded. Whilst lying in the hospital ward, Gol Collier, the previous officer who had been brain damaged to the point of imbecilehood during the war on Fantine, had entered the hospital ward, picked up McKenna, and carried him out, all the way through the streets of the Civitas Beati to the sacred balneary, where Gol Collier, bless his tiny mind at the time, had heard that the saint's miraculous waters were the waters that had healed the saint during her original conquest of the Sabbat worlds, waters that could cure any ailment. And so he brought McKenna into the pool and started dipping him under. Normally this would end in a rather tragic drowning incident, but before Gol Collier could finish drowning McKenna, they were interrupted by a third person, Sarnian, or again, the Saint, depending upon whom you ask. The two hospital escapees had also been followed by Ibrahim Gaunt, who had been told of their mysterious disappearance by the hospital staff. He arrived just in time to see Sarnian dip the two of them underwater and bring them back up again. Gaunt would later testify that at the time he did not know if she was healing or drowning them. But any confusion was swiftly dispelled when McKenna simply walked out of the hot spring under his own machine. The man had not been able to stand even mere minutes ago. And even weirder, Gol Collier also hauled himself from the water and started speaking in full sentences again, and wondering where he was and if he'd missed anything. Well, now there's some girl bathwater worth the asking price. The two were immediately brought to the medicus offices again to be examined, and miraculously, they were both fully healed. McKenna was fit as a fiddle, better than ever in fact. There were not even a trace of blood left in his abdomen from his enormous internal bleeding wound. And as for Gol Collier, his situation was even more absurd. In the case of McKenna, his injuries had simply disappeared, as if they were never even there. But Collier, who had had half of his brain evicted out the back of his skull, well, his brain hadn't regrown. He was still missing a significant portion of his grey matter, and yet he was talking, he was fully cognizant, and appeared to be every bit the Gol Collier he had been before his injury, even though it was quite literally, physically impossible for him to be so. As an Inquisitor, I have seen and heard of quite a bit of weird stuff in my career, but this is pretty far up on the freaky shit that may or may not require a bonfire scale. And Colonel Commissar Gaunt was extremely wise, for once, to immediately contact the High Ecclesiarch on the planet and summon agents of the Ministorum to have the miracle adequately documented and classified as such, as otherwise, again, people have been burned for significantly less. as unnatural regeneration tends to be a feature of the spikier and more supernatural servants of the Great Four in the Warp. But this will make it a lot more difficult to doubt that Sarnion is the real deal. Gaunt, immediately after having informed the ecclesiarchy of the miracle so that they could begin the process of documenting and verifying it, rushed off to a council of war held by Lord General Lugo to provide his own debriefing on the situation on the outskirts of the Civitas Beati, and about the military situation overall. It was here that he informed the Lord General about the miracle. The Lord General was visibly taken aback, asking Gaunt specifically what he meant by miracle. Apparently, the good Lord General had not seen or heard of his little saint doing anything like this so far. Well, I suppose it doesn't exactly come as a major shock at this point that Lord General Lugo had been using his saint mostly for PR purposes. But what does come as a little bit of a surprise is that she hadn't displayed any saintly powers up until now. What exactly had been going on here? Sarnion herself, as far as we are aware, genuinely believed herself to be the saint. Lord General Lugo had no doubt reinforced these beliefs at every opportunity, so as to make sure that his banner was as convincing as possible. And he had seemingly done a fine job of it, as when Sarnion led the counterattack, she did so very effectively, even convincing Ibrahim Gaunt, upon me laying eyes on her at once, that she was indeed the genuine article. Now, you can do a lot with special effects, of course, but it does seem as if there was something special with Sarnion. Bearing in mind as well, she'd convinced all the others that she'd encountered up until that point, or at the very least, convinced them enough for them to play along with the Lord General's plans. The only ones that had rejected her were first Ibrahim Gaunt, and then the Tanith First and Only's new cleric, Ayatani Swale, who had joined them after their adventures on Hagia. He too had been more excited than anyone for the return of the saint. He was one of her priests, a wandering preacher, whose entire purpose for living was to walk in her footsteps. But upon actually meeting her, he too had denounced her as merely Sarnion, and not as the saint. Yet, what are we to make of the miracle now then? Well, remember the miracle girl we talked about earlier? The one that carried out several examples of what appeared to be genuine miracles. Halting crowds, blocking fire, leading children out of danger, all of that stuff. When she died, that was the same moment that Sarnion apparently gained her new radiance. It seems conceivable, as this has been documented in previous cases of living saints, that Sarnion was indeed the saint, or at the very least, more correctly, her designated vessel in this mortal world. And the young girl was her spiritual representation, her, well, in essence, psychic ghost, the angel. There have been many documented examples of the God Emperor's angels, of the spiritual type, descending and carrying out miracles, and even fighting alongside his servants. And to clarify, not the angels of death, the actual angel kind. In fact, we have a documented example of that in the Sabbat World's Crusade and with the Tanith First and Only, with Sniper Larkin. It may even be that the saint on Hagia was the same as the saint that directed Larkin, who was the same as the saint who carried out all of these supernatural actions on Herodor. That she had, in fact, always been with the people of the Sabbat worlds in spirit, but diffuse, cast across a huge area as more of a patron saint of a tremendously vast area of space. But now, in the Imperium's need, she coalesced. The destruction of her psychic form, if we can even call it that, would then have forced her into her physical body, in the same way that many servants of the chaotic powers can only continue to exist in the real world if they have some sort of anchor, either via a host being, a literal anchor point as in an item that keeps them bound to reality, or in areas with sufficient warp permutation. We could delve into an argument about whether or not living saints are in fact simply just demons of a more glorious nature, and I believe in fact we have had that discussion at some point previously in the archive, but we're getting awfully heretical here for a document discussing the return of Saint Sabbat. Regardless of the nature of the saint, how she came about her powers and or when, it appeared now to be pretty damn uncontroversial that she did indeed have powers, and that a fair few of her previous minders weren't aware of that fact. How is Lord General Lugo going to respond to this, precisely, now that his little standard not only has a mind of its own, but the power with which to back it up as well? Perhaps nothing need change. After all, she's still indebted to him, right? And if she turns out to be a real saint, or some sort of miracle maker, then all the better. I do imagine that right now Lord General Lugo is also evaluating the scenario of whether or not she could be something entirely different altogether, and just how boned he might be if that turns out to be the case. But for the moment, there appears to be no immediate reason to begin panicking just yet. Besides, Lord General Lugo has more immediate concerns to worry himself with. He informs Gaunt that reinforcements are incoming, regiments of the Imperial Guard, and further Imperial Navy warships, which will turn Herodor into a proper fortified planet. So as long as there is no immediate, as in the next literal 2 days, danger of the Civitas Beati being overrun, then everything should be just fine. Famous last words, if any were ever uttered. As of course, dark shadows are already beginning to spread across the Civitas Beati. Because if Sanian really is a genuine bona fide saint, then you better believe that Chaos knows about that as well. And they're not going to be satisfied with sending a simple scouting force to kill possibly the single most powerful and impactful weapon the Imperial Crusade has ever or will ever see. And that is just what they're thinking of doing. Imperial reinforcements are hurrying through the warp to Herodor even as we speak. A major flotilla including carriers, capital ships, and several more regiments of heavy Imperial Guard troops, along with additional fortifications and improvements to the Civitas Beati. There is a brief window of opportunity to strike now. But it's not quite that simple either. Whilst Chaos is aware of the incredible importance of Herodor right now, it is not an undefended world. The forces upon its surface may be somewhat lackluster, but in orbit sits the battleship Omnia Vincent, along with the frigates Navarre, Berengaria, and the Glory of Cadia, and the heavy cruiser Laudate Divinitas. By no means an insignificant force. Indeed, it should prove quite the challenge to any would-be raider. The greatest issue the fleet is currently dealing with is the hundreds of pilgrim vessels that are interfering with the warship's ability to properly picket the planet. Not to mention wasting a tremendous amount of their time stopping, searching, scanning, and constantly updating and aiding the vessels themselves, as the merchant ships arrive with little preamble and could be carrying pretty much anything. A good deal of them are barely void-worthy and constantly drift out of their assigned orbital positions. Not to mention a whole host of other problems, be it supplies, repair, mechanical failure, or as is happening right now, the transport Troubadour, reporting a fire raging across its decks. It requests assistance from the Imperial Navy, and the Navarre moves to offer it. Poor timing, as Fleet Captain Esquine aboard the Omnia Vincent was just about to give the Navarre the order to move up to the closest warp convergence point to Herodor. Instead, the fleet captain chose the frigate Berengaria to move up instead, its fighter screen deployed and its weapons active. There had been another group of ships detected on the way towards Herodor, you see, although very little of their actual nature, purpose, or, well, anything, frankly, could be gleaned, due to the massive warp overload that had been caused by so many ships coming and going to Herodor. It was expected to be simply yet more pilgrim ships, but the fleet captain had been ordered to exercise maximum caution by the War Master himself, and he intended to follow those orders. In the fleet captain's word, the Berengaria could either welcome incoming friendlies or repel incoming hostiles. Incidentally, as an aside, there is also some documented confusion as to the nature of the Berengaria herself. The fleet captain referred to her as a frigate. The Berengaria herself would probably have preferred to have been referred to as a light cruiser. But I suppose anything smaller than a grand cruiser is all the same to a captain of a battleship. Regardless, as the Berengaria moved towards the convergence point, things took a turn for the mysterious in the rearward lines. The Navarre, having moved to assist the transport Troubadour, had attached its boarding ramps firmly to the ship, and were ready to begin transferring its firefighting teams over to the Troubadour when the source of their entire maneuvering and docking, the fire, seemingly disappeared. The heat readings that the Troubadour had been detecting flickered out and vanished. This is unusual. And as we have learned, unusual things tend to be very, very bad things in the 41st millennium, with at least one recent exception, so there's that. However, the crew aboard the Navarre were not particularly confident that this was going to be one of those good things. Initially, the Navarre had elected to not stand two armsmen alongside the docking clamps, 9 in total connecting it to the Troubadour. Now, however, one group of armsmen were brought up to investigate the strange occurrences. This group of armsmen went into the Troubadour and were never heard from again, unless you count the sudden overloading burst of static that emerged from the Vauxhorn on the ship's bridge, as a grenade detonated in the middle of the group of armsmen. The order was of course immediately given to sever all 9 of the docking clamps, but they were no longer responding to the remote controls from the Navarre's bridge, which could only mean that boarding parties had already raced across those very selfsame docking connections and disabled the override on the other side. The Navarre was about to have a very bad day, as the order was given for all armsmen to stand to and begin repelling boarders. Luckily, at least the Navarre's misfortune appeared to be it and its alone, as the warp disturbance that had been heralding the arrival of more ships broke open and deposited Imperial ships into real space, including another Imperial Navy frigate to join Fleet Captain Esquine's formation. The warp convergence, however, did not close. This was not unexpected, as the size of the disturbance indicated something along the lines of a dozen or more vessels, and yet only 8 had actually arrived. Still, if the first wave was Imperial, the odds were pretty damn overwhelmingly good that the next waves would be Imperials as well. That this was simply just a strung-out convoy of allied ships. Feeling relieved, Fleet Captain Esquine then sent messages to the Navarre, inquiring as to whether or not it required any assistance to defeat the boarders that had apparently arrived from the Troubadour. This was unusual, of course, but, well, there had already been significant uprisings on the planet down below from heretics insurgents that had infiltrated alongside the various pilgrims and their pilgrim vessels, of course. It stood to reason, therefore, that other insurgents had remained hidden aboard their ships, and this group had apparently managed to seize control of the Troubadour and launched some sort of a desperate gambit, an ambush, in an effort to seize command of the Navarre, to blow up a warship. Who knows? Aboard the Navarre, Captain Bismarck received the offer for aid and declined it. It was his estimate that the Navarre's armsmen could repel these boarders and push them back into the Troubadour. Once this was achieved, they would of course enter in the manual override codes to blow the docking clamps, and then the Navarre would destroy the Troubadour. Simple enough. First, of course, the docking clamps had to actually be reached, but whilst the action was growing quite heavy, it appeared to be well within the capabilities of the Navarre's armsmen to deal with. No need to divert further already overstretched Imperial resources to hasten the matter. Unfortunately, and beyond Captain Bismarck's understanding at that point in time, things were about to get a lot more complicated. The Troubadour was not intending or hoping to overwhelm the Navarre with merely heretic insurgents. No, they were using significantly more esoteric methods as well. Some sort of mind control spell. Those who encountered it reported a loud buzzing that seemed to settle in between their ears somewhere, after which many of the Navarre's armsmen and crew were lost to chaotic influence. Simultaneously as this was happening as well, the next wave of ships were coming through the warp disturbance, but they were not Imperials this time. A Chaos fleet had quite clearly, and very cleverly as well, managed to coast in behind onto the wake of an incoming Imperial force to hide itself from the searching augurs of the Imperial defenders. Now, under normal, more ideal circumstances, this could probably have been detected, either by the first incoming Imperial fleet or by the fleet already in station above Herodor. But again, with all the warp disturbances, it went largely unnoticed, allowing 4 Chaos warships to breach the thin veil of reality and coast in at full attack speed towards the Imperial defenders. Of course, Fleet Captain Esquine had not been caught completely unaware. He had already routed a frigate up to the convergence point to make sure that they could escort in allies or meet enemies, along with a fighter screen to provide support. But the scale of the enemy attack would not be so easily repelled by a single frigate, as early augur estimates suggested 4 warships, 3 cruisers and 1 enormous capital ship. As the fleet began the procedure of attempting to identify exactly what vessels they were up against, Fleet Captain Esquine immediately gave the orders for everyone to man battle stations and prepare to repel the raiders. The first step, of course, was identification and organization. Requests went out yet again to see if the Navarre was done with its invasion problem. It was not. Its armsmen were still fighting against the borders from the Troubadour. They would not be available for some time yet. The other vessels, however, all reported that they were ready to advance, and the preliminary identification of the enemy vessels was also beginning to stream in. 2 of the cruisers had been positively identified as the Cicatrice and the Revenant. The 3rd cruiser was identified as either the Suture or more likely the Harm's Way, and the 4th and by far largest vessel was classified as a battleship and assigned the provisional identification as the Incardine. That meant that the poor Berengaria found itself in the path of 3 cruisers and a battleship. An unenviable position for a frigate to be in. The first of the enemy warships, the Revenant, coasted by the Berengaria at maximum speed, all energy rerouted to its engines as it shot past, pursuing the Imperial convoy that had emerged before the Chaos Raiders not 20 minutes ago. As the Revenant passed, the Berengaria, of course, attempted to engage with its flank lance batteries. But at that speed, it only really got off 1 volley, and it was nowhere near enough to inflict serious telling damage upon the speeding cruiser. And that would be pretty much the Berengaria's sole singular contribution to the battle, as she now found herself being pummeled by the lancers and guns of the 2 remaining cruisers and the Incardine. The Berengaria stood bravely and did not retreat even until the very end, when a barrage of torpedoes from the Harm's Way struck her amidship from the flank, even as the Incardine's lance batteries finally overwhelmed her shields and gutted the warship from stem to stern. Not a great start for the Imperials, and it was only going to get worse, as the Revenant, still out of effective weapons range of the rest of the Imperial fleet, now entered firing distance towards the Imperial convoy, blowing 2 of the huge and lumbering mass conveyance transports into pieces, even as Fleet Captain Esquine gave the order for the Imperial battle line to advance, in an attempt to shield the rest of the convoy and also to protect the ships already in anchor above Herodor. Although 1 civilian vessel, the Somnambulist, was to take its main source of damage from the Omnia Vincent rather than the enemy Chaos ships, as the Vincent fired a single lance weapon at the Somnambulus, destroying its engines. It had been trying to break for high anchor and move to what it perceived, presumably, to be safety, but with the civilian transport's engines, any safety it could head towards would have been illusionary at best. And if all of the various civilian ships started moving about, that would only complicate the situation for the Imperial defenders. And so a quick example was made from the Somnambulus of what would happen to any other ships that decided to break anchor without express permission. Yet another urging was also issued to the Navarre to finish her boarding action and rejoin the rest of the fleet. Aboard the Navarre, Captain Wismarck apparently agreed. He issued the emergency override procedure on the docking clamps, blowing both the clamps and significant portions of the hull in total off the Navarre, before issuing the order to target the Troubadour and destroy it. All well and good. It had caused some damage to the Navarre and had cost about 100 armsmen their lives, as they were given no opportunity to evacuate the areas that would necessarily be vented into space. But at least now the frigate was at long last free and could start heading towards the rest of the Imperial battle line. Or so it was assumed by the Navarre's crew, as Captain Bismarck ordered another firing solution to be created. Again, weird things are usually bad things in the 41st millennium, as of course there were no enemy warships anywhere near the effective firing envelope of the Navarre. Her sister frigate, the Solstice, however, was. And that was the very target that Captain Bismarck was designating. There were objections, of course, but Captain Bismarck silenced them with fists and service weapon. And soon thereafter, the Navarre's weapons cut through the Solstice, creating the second Imperial casualty of the fight, as the Chaos brain control that had been seeping its way into the vessel from its connection with the now destroyed Troubadour had done its work. Fleet Captain Esquine's force was down 3 frigates, and he'd barely fired a shot in anger at the invading Chaos warships. This was turning out to be an exceptionally shit day to be in the Imperial Navy. Scrambling now to get a grip on the situation, Fleet Captain Esquine ordered his heavy cruiser, the Laudate Divinitatis, to strike towards Herodor, where it would engage and destroy the Chaos cruiser, the Revenant, which was currently preoccupied with slaughtering helpless pilgrim vessels in orbit. By diverting his only other sizable warship, Fleet Captain Esquine was taking a big gamble here. The hope was that the Laudate Divinitas could destroy the Revenant quickly and then rejoin the battle line, as the Omnia Vincent would find herself severely outgunned in the face of the other 2 Chaos cruisers and battleship, with only frigates to support her. However, the captain's hopes would not come to fruition, as the Laudate Divinitatis severely underestimated her smaller but far more ferocious opponent. Despite initially taking a stinging barrage from the Laudate Divinitatis, the Revenant swung around quickly, responding with its own weaponry and outmaneuvering the heavy cruiser. A lucky hit from the smaller Revenant's weapon batteries opening up a gap in the Laudate Divinitatis shields, a gap that the Revenant was swift to exploit. Pouring all of its firepower into this newfound weakness, the Laudate Divinitatis began to shudder and explode, as countless internal detonations tore the vessel apart, leaving the Revenant safe to settle into high orbit above Herodor and begin the deployment of its landing parties. Simultaneously, the main Imperial fleet force encountered the incoming Chaos main force. The engagement started out favorably for the Imperium, as the Glory of Cadia struck well above its weight class, crippling the cruiser Cicatrice. The doughty little frigate had moved in close to punish the far heavier ship, but this left her exposed as well. Even as fires raged through the Cicatrice's decks, she used the last vestiges of her forward momentum and energy to propel herself straight in to the Glory of Cadia, destroying both vessels in the collision. Quickly stripped of her escorts, the Omnia Vincent now found herself alone, mercilessly bombarded by the remaining Chaos cruiser, the Harm's Way, and the battleship in Cardine. The Omnia Vincent responded as well as she could, but again luck was not on the Imperium's side. A torpedo from the Harm's Way managed to slip past the Omnia Vincent's intercept network. Boring slowly through her shields, it struck right beneath the battleship's bridge. injuring or outright killing the majority of her command and control crew, leaving the captain, Esquine, completely crippled and mortally wounded. Severed from his mind impulse link, he could do nothing to command the enormous vessel. Desperate efforts were undertaken by other officers to try and keep the ship in the fight, whilst emergency repairs were carried out that might allow her to return to the offensive. But before any such valiant efforts could be concluded, a group of Locust fighters made it into the Omnia Vincent hangars. One was destroyed immediately by point defenses. Another one, rather impotently, unloaded its payload into the hangars, causing some damage but nothing severe. The third Locust, however, gunning its engines to the max on a suicide run, managed to reach one of the Omnia Vincent's munitions elevator and dumped its entire weapons payload straight down into it, causing a mass chain reaction that blew out the entire ship's flank. Laying now dead in the void, without engines and without shields, the Omnia Vincent was merely a vast hunk of scrap metal, as the Chaos warships moved in close and executed the venerable Imperial ship with point-blank land salvos, before the Harm's Way and Encarnadine settled in next to the Revenant and began deploying their own invasion forces. Down on the planet, not particularly shockingly, everything was panic. The handful of communications that had been received from the fleet in orbit initially suggested that the Imperial Navy elements had a decent chance of repelling or outright destroying the attackers. But as time wore on, the news became significantly less optimistic. From the scattered reports, it appeared as if only a single one of the invading vessels had been destroyed, and the Imperial fleet had been all but eradicated. There were also reports of strange vessels in amongst the Chaos forces, one apparently claiming to have positively identified a Dark Eldar fighter from the reports of the countless tiny ships, the fighters and the bombers, that had been swirling around in the fight whilst their mother vessels fought. The defenders were of course completely unaware of this as of yet, but the Chaos invasion force was, by and large, frankly, a distraction from the real thrust of the matter. 9 assassins, hand-picked by the Magister himself, would go down to the surface of the planet and execute the Imperial Saint. Innocenti was not taking any chances here, and even as the Imperial ground commanders feared that this navy would simply stand off in orbit and bombard the Civitas Beati, which it most assuredly could have done, the Civitas Beati did not have the shields or the orbital defenses to deny them. The worry was dispelled as mass landing operations were undertaken by the Chaos fleet. A small comfort, as there still appeared to be more than enough Chaos forces to overwhelm the Civitas Beati many times over. But at the very least, this death was less certain than the one that could have been delivered from orbit. But certainty was also the very reason why it would not be delivered from the sky. Innocenti knew that an orbital bombardment, no matter how heavy, no matter how methodical, no matter how overwhelming, could not guarantee the Saint's death. And even if it was all but certain, the simple lack of absolute proof would give the Imperials all the hope they needed to continue to believe in their Saint. Only a body, only a confirmed kill would be good enough. And if a few tens of thousands of servants needed to be sacrificed for that body to be delivered at Innocenti's feet, then that was a price he was more than willing to pay. How much, however, was still up to the defenders for the moment. The Civitas Beati had, while not really expected to be the focus of anything of this scale, But like all good Imperial military districts, it had taken some precautions to ready itself in the case of enemy action, and particularly considering this was a world in the Sabbat worlds, it had prepared itself to be invaded by the arch-enemy. The plan that was chosen today was GAR-3, Ground Assault Response Number 3. The plan was as simple as it was unavoidable in this set of circumstances. The Civitas militia and the planetary defense forces would gather up alongside the life company of General Lugo and the ghosts in the center of the Civitas Beati. There they would remain, staged and as fully mounted as they could be, alongside their supporting armor, and they would move to respond to whatever attack the Chaos forces mounted against them. It was the obvious move, forced as much upon the defenders as it was chosen, as they were now severely outnumbered and assaulted from orbit, meaning that the attackers could land their troops, well, wherever they damn well pleased. Attempting to throw up any sort of defensive cordon around the city, or to rely on fixed positions, would be extremely foolish. As if the Imperials elected to mass in the south, well, the Chaos invaders could simply dump all of their troops in the north, and vice versa, and so on. And unfortunately, it appeared as if the enemy understood this advantage as well. The initial Chaos landings were formed of a group of about 8,000 infantry and 300 light vehicles, mostly stock tanks, AT-70 stegs, and a handful of AT-83 heavier vehicles. This would merely be the spearhead advance pushing into the Civitas Beati, and they would spread out across the northwest, northeast, and southern approaches to the Civitas, forcing the Imperials immediately to spread out to meet multiple advances. Now, for the moment at least, they would possess a numerical advantage in infantry. They're now 17-odd thousand, with the addition of all of the city's Arbites troops also levied into military service, but they were already outnumbered close to 2-to-1 in armor, and a lot of that armor was, well, trucks. Light vehicles, unarmed with anything more than possibly a stub gun at best. The only semi-decent armor the defenders possessed were mostly located within General Lugo's Lifeguard Company, including a group of Vanquisher Lehman Russ main battle tanks. Their long-barreled anti-tank guns would prove very, very useful and in high demand during the initial skirmishes. They were also luxuriously equipped with specialized armor-piercing shells, which should, in theory, give them the edge against anything the Chaos forces were capable of deploying. In theory, that is, at least. But the defenders did have one advantage, and that was intimate knowledge of the Civitas Beati itself. You see, Ground Assault Response Number 3 was not merely just the general outlay of a strategy to deny an invasion, it also came with detailed notes and annotations across the city's layout, pointing out areas where ambushes might be carried out, pointing out covered paths of travel where troops could move without fear of being attacked from above, as dive bombers were already beginning to rain down upon the Civitas Beati from the Chaos fleet in orbit. The plan had also laid out a detailed study of where troops could strike and then fall back to strike again, creating multiple overlapping layers of ambush zones, where the enemy could be dragged in only to be hit hard by yet further troops laying in wait, even as the first ambushing group would bypass the defenders to rearm and resupply, then to stand by ready to repel yet further invaders as the next group withdraw to do the same. All credit must be extended to Beati of the Civitas Beati defense force here, as he had clearly wargamed out a tremendous amount of scenarios for the defense of his beloved home city. Were it not for his detailed instructions and meticulous planning, the defenders might very well have found themselves at a severe disadvantage almost as soon as the first shot was being fired. Instead, it was the Chaos scouting forces that would get their nose bloodied. The Tarnith would be deployed in the northeast in the Masonry area, where some of the heaviest fighting was expected. The Blood Pact came on practically in parade formation, singing as they came, and taking the time to destroy various items of religious significance on the way, blowing up bell towers or destroying aqueducts. Granted, the latter would eventually deny the city access to clean water in, a few months, when whatever stores they had ran out, but it was sort of a strategic objective. Sort of. At least significantly more so than the bell towers. But the mirthful advance did not last very long, as the Blood Pact quickly realized that they were in for some pretty serious resistance. The Tarnith, of course, excelled at this kind of warfare, where they were able to strike quickly and effectively. Their beloved tread feathers being more than enough to deal with AT-70s, stalk tanks, and occasionally the AT-83 brigands as well. Granted, those would usually need to be engaged either with tube charges to blow up their tracks or via outflanking positions, as shooting them in the flanks or the rear, or better yet the top, would be ideal. Luckily, the Civitas Beati was, as the name of course implies, a heavily built-up urban area, offering ample opportunity both for outflanking and out-elevating the enemy. Thus, the initial Blood Pact advance early in the day was quickly stymied with heavy casualties, and no real gains to speak of. The Blood Pact were not amateurs at this either, however, and began around noon to pull back their advanced forces, realizing that advancing on a wide front, although theoretically wise to overwhelm what they presumed to be a numerically inferior defender, which incidentally was not the case as of yet at least, well, the strategy had proven somewhat disastrous, and so now they refocused. Instead of attempting to spread out and overwhelm the enemy's ability to defend themselves, instead the Blood Pact would mass their armor into one thrust down the main transit arteries of the Civitas Beati, after which they could then, after having secured the transitway, begin spreading out from the transitway and into the city, thus, in theory, avoiding a great deal of the more obvious ambush areas. That would require, however, for them to first smash through the main transit artery, which was in and of itself an obvious strategic feature for the defenders to hold on to. Having therefore expected this obvious change of tactic from the invader, the Life Company tanks, their treasured vanquishers, were located right here, ready to take advantage of an infantry ambush to sally forth and destroy the lead enemy armor. Several AT-70s, Stegs, and even AT-83s were quickly destroyed. But the previous assumption that the Life Company vanquishers would be enough to deal with anything the enemy was going to throw at them was quickly and brutally proven incorrect, as one of their number was not merely destroyed, but blown to smithereens as its hull was impacted upon by an enormous main battery shell, as a blood-packed, super-heavy Baneblade tank began rolling down the highway, firing as it came. It turns out that the arch-enemy had been playing tricks of their very own, realizing that the Imperial defenders had spread out in order to stymie them across a wide front, and that they were unlikely to break through quickly, the Blood Pact commanders had instead decided to up the ante and force a decision, and they would do so via 3 measures. The first was listening into Imperial communications, which had been broken within hours of the Chaos Force's arrival, as their own tactical logistical units had figured out their entire dataset, and were now allowing their ground force commanders to listen in to Imperial communication. Obviously, the Imperials, suspecting that this might happen, either through technological or psychic means, were communicating only using code words to refer to commanders and locations throughout the city, which the Imperials would then cross-reference with Ground Assault Response 3 to figure out exactly what all of this meant. This would still, however, give the invaders a serious advantage, as they would quickly be able to get a good estimate and a picture of where the defenders were located. The second part of the plan was to blanket cut off all Imperial communications. Having gleaned all they figured they needed to from the Imperial Vox network, the next step was to employ psychers to broadcast broadband interference, shutting down all communication, both Blood Pact and Imperial. But the Blood Pact could of course communicate via warp means, whereas the Imperials were completely unable to do so over anything more than very short distances. And the third part of the plan was to, right before the jamming set in, present the Imperials with an obvious target: the large advance down the main arterials of the city, expected to be met by the enemy's premier anti-tank vehicles, the greatest threat to the enormous masses of Chaos forces still marshalling out in the Obsidian Wastes. And the Imperials had fallen for the bait, and had lost quite a number of their own vanquishers, their premier in both efficiency and maneuverability anti-tank platforms, in the face of a Baneblade. The Baneblade might very well have been able to lead a spearhead thrust straight down the throat of the Civitas Beati thereafter, were it not for the intervention of the Saint. For the only thing more powerful than a Baneblade is a walking nuclear weapon, which is pretty much what a Saint is upon contact with the enemy. Armed with nothing more than a sword and a pistol, she cut the Baneblade apart, tearing open its hatches, killing its crew, and dumping crack grenades down through the hatches, destroying the Baneblade in mere seconds. And even more impressive than her ability to swing a sword through a tank barrel is the effect that she had upon the Imperial defenders. Gathering up what platoons she came across as she moved, she led a counter-assault that sent the Blood Pact reeling back out of the Masonry district. Not merely re-establishing Imperial defense lines as they were about to begin to falter, but throwing the Blood Pact out to the point where the Imperials could actually advance in the Saints' wake and re-establish even deeper defenses. It was not to be all good news this day, however, for whilst the majority of the defenses had held very well, in the west things were beginning to crack. After having offered effective and very stubborn resistance through the entirety of the day, panic set in just after midnight, when Vibison, the commander in the glasswork sections in the west, was killed by what at first appeared to be a lucky shot, blowing his brains out all over his second-in-command. Vibison had been the primary reason why the western defences had held as well as they had. On no less than 3 separate occasions, they had almost collapsed completely, with Blood Pact penetrations of the Western District. Each and every time it was Vibison who had led a countercharge to reseal the defences and hunt down and destroy the Blood Pact who had slipped through the net. With him dead, and that fact now being broadcast loudly across the communications networks, whom, Ironically enough, the Imperials had just managed to start freeing up to their immediate cost by destroying the enemy's interference vehicles. Well, now the news of Vibison's death spread like wildfire through the defenders, causing multiple major breakthroughs in the western sectors. And the man responsible for those breakthroughs, a blood-packed sniper by the name of Saul, who had been tasked along with 8 others to hunt down the Saint, simply followed the destructive wake of the Blood Pact as he moved deeper into the city in search of his quarry. And Saul was far from the only one of the archenemy's assassins to cause some serious problems for the defenders. The Tarnith's first and only had managed to maintain a very solid front line that nothing seemed to be able to slip through until 3 other assassins, a pack of Loxotol siblings, cut through the defenders, near mortally wounding Commissar Hark in the process by tearing off one of his arms. Hark did manage to make this an expensive endeavor for the Loxotols though, as even though their amphibious scaly hides were near impervious to lasfire, that did not stop Hark's bolt pistol from finding purchase within one of them, killing the first of the assassins. On a wider level then, the first day had worked out relatively well for the Imperial defenders, everything considered. The mess in the glassworks was a major concern, and reserve reinforcements would need to be thrown in to try and stymie the Blood Pact advance there the next day. But even so, having been in possession of virtually no artillery heavier than mortars or light short snub-barreled artillery pieces, the defenders had managed to hold out well against the enemy's infantry advances. Equally so, despite not having much in the way of anti-tank weaponry, besides a handful of vanquishers and shoulder-mounted tube launchers, the enemy's armor had not managed to gain solid purchase in the city either. And despite the enemy's absolute superiority in the air, the defenders' ability to stick close to the invader had prevented the dive bombers and the locusts from doing too much damage, as they ran too large of a risk of striking their own troops in the close confines of the Civitas Beati. Now, it must also then be hurriedly pointed out that the reasons why the Imperials had done so well were twofold. One, the counterattack led by the Saint Sabbat destroying the enemy super heavy, and thus retreating the situation that was looking grim indeed in the Masonry district. And 2, the simple fact that Chaos had not attacked with all their forces. Indeed, their efforts so far could be described as nothing more than a reconnaissance in force, a simple probe to determine the strength of the defenders and their positions, as even early on in the day, the general estimate was that there was over 500,000 Chaos troops massing in the plains outside the Civitas Beati, and perhaps as much as 100,000 pieces of armor of various weight classes. After having continued to land troops for the rest of the day, there might very well be 1 million or more enemies ready to invade the city the next day. Presumably the only reason they hadn't done so was, well, 2 things. Firstly, the same reason why they didn't level the city from orbit. They were hoping to give their assassins a good opportunity to break the Imperials' morale by killing off the Saint, and securing themselves a well-preserved corpse by doing so, instead of burying her beneath an artillery barrage. And 2, because they wanted to make absolutely certain. They wanted to surround the entire Civitas Beati and leave no escape for the Saint. And they very nearly got their wish as well, as later on in the day, the Blood Pact sniper, Saul, was the first one of the assassins to get a shot at the Saint. She was leading a mass sermon alongside many of the Imperial Guard servicemen, the PDF, and the militia forces. She was completely exposed, and Sal even had her dead to rights were it not for the fact that the young Tarnith Piper boy, Bryn Milo, who had always had a bit of a charmed life to him, one of the many stakers the Tarnith regiment seemed to harbour on a near habitual basis, who always managed to get just in the way of Sal's shot, and not wanting to risk a lethal kill shot with an intervening object, Sal held his fire every time, till the point where he missed his window of opportunity. He was spotted by one of the Tarnith snipers, Helene Larkin, who had just got a feeling that there was somebody out there and was raising his last rifle to take aim when Sal got a tingle down his back. Sinking back into cover just in time to save himself, Sal began to reposition, but Helene had already sent out the warning to the other Tarnith snipers in the area. The Saint was not quite as unprotected as she at first seemed, and the next time Sal popped up to take a shot, another Tarnith sniper, Nessa Burra, was waiting for him, and blew his head off with a precise long-last shot. And so the second of the 9 died. Even though the Imperials, of course, still did not know there were 9 of them, although this would soon be revealed to Ibrahim Gaunt, as he experienced another strange psychic happenstance. He entered a door on Herodor and met again the nun that he had encountered in the forest on Ex-Cardinal, the nun that had been a sister of battle that had served under the Beati during the initial conquest of the Sabbat worlds. You know, I'm starting to think that Ibrahim God might simply just be an absolute unrepentant lunatic. I mean, come on. All I'm in essence saying here is that for a non-insane person, he certainly does seem to see an awful lot of crazy stuff. Anywho, the nun informed him that there would be 9 assassins coming for the Beati, and that Ibrahim had to stand between them and her. She also gave him instructions on how to do so. Cryptic and largely useless, but one interesting piece there within was related to organ soaring. Now, Gaunt was going to have more pressing things to deal with immediately, as come the next day the Chaos Forces threw their full weight into the attack, causing countless breaches in the Imperial second line of defenses. And worse still, their command structure was beginning to collapse. Yet more officers were dying left, right, and center. Holes in the Imperial defensive line opened for seemingly no reason, as if somebody had simply walked through. And then there was the death of Lanfred, the commander of Lugo's Life Company. He had simply just gone offline, stopped responding to communications, as he and his command headquarters had seemingly just disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving yet another gaping hole in the Imperial defenses, and taking away the defenders' main source of elite fighters and armor as well. Even the Tarnith were barely doing any better, and a full-scale withdrawal, a rout more like really, to the city's central keep was ordered. This would mean the abandonment, in essence, of the entirety of the Civitas Beati, all of its civilian populace, and anyone who was too slow to get into the keep in time. And problematically enough, one of the forces refusing to retreat was the Saint herself, who was fighting on the front line. Gaunt, Lugo, Biagi, everyone had sent her orders to begin her withdrawal to the keep as quickly as possible, with yet further impetus being lent this order by the fact that they now knew that they were assassins looking for her in particular. I kind of feel like the Imperials should have been guessing that from the beginning, as there was literally no other reason why the Chaos Forces would even be on Herodor, but hey, granted, they did have other things to concern their minds with at the time. Joining the rest of the withdrawing forces, Gaunt made his back towards the rear as well, where he summoned up Orgon Sorek, who had already confessed to his secret. He was a psyker, and a very specific one as well. Ibrahim Gaunt managed to keep him from being executed immediately, but he was going to be held very carefully, as nobody was really in the mood to be trusting psychers at the moment. But after the intervention of the mysterious nun, having told Ibrahim Gaunt to rely on Sorek, he asked him what questions he thought were useful, and Orgon provided some actual information, specifically the nature of the assassins. 3 reptiles, 3 psychers, a death machine, a marksman, and a phantom. Vague though that may be, that was by far the most firm intelligence that Gaunt had received on the matter so far. Now, the marksman was already dead. A sniper had been reported killed near the Beati, so that was 1 down. Hark had also mumbled something about being attacked by Loxitals, and having presumably managed to kill one of them, so that is 2 assassins down. As for a phantom, well, this jived with previous reports of a Dark Eldar ship, an assassin, a mandrake of some sort. Now, the Psychers and the Death Machine were still unclear, but at the very least now the defenders had something to act upon, and yet further insistent urgings were sent to the Beati to get her to start withdrawing. Luckily for the Imperials, another 3 would soon join the Marksman and the Reptile, as one of the assassins was Father Sin, the man who had almost killed Corm Korbek on the Saints' world of Hagia. He had apparently gotten a hold of a couple of runt baby psychers, incredibly potent things that he was somehow able to control. He ran into Corm Korbek again here on Herodor, and this time it was Korbek who drew the longest straw, shoving a pipe bomb into Father Sin's mouth and tearing off the detonation tape. Yeah, good luck coming back from that one. Although it would later turn out that he had already succeeded in his part of the mission. The Loxital mercenaries would also soon be killed, by Rorn and Nessie Banda, and Gol Collier finishing off the last 2 of them in the running skirmishes that were now happening throughout the city, as the Imperials were attempting to rush back to the keep and the last remaining defendable areas of the Civitas Beati. The Mandrake, the Dark Eldar assassin, was killed by the Tarnif chief of scouts, McCall, a famously taciturn man who would later admit that the Mandrake had been pretty good before he'd put a lasbolt between his eyes. The final of the assassins, the Death Machine, revealed itself within the heart of the sacred balneary, where the Saint had brought together the commanders of the Imperial Defense, along with several others to be honored in one final sermon, which she personally would lead. It would no doubt have been lovely, were it not for the Chaos Dreadnought that broke up through the bottom of the sacred fountain and tried to murder everyone, succeeding in murdering quite a few of the commanders of the Civitas defenses and the Imperial commanders as well. The Dreadnought was only stopped because of Gaunt's intervention, as he was wielding the only weapon around that could actually carve an opening in the Dreadnought sarcophagus, the power sword of Hieronymus Sondar, which Gaunt had of course been granted after the defense of Vervanhive. The blue-wreathed sword managed to tear open a deep gash in the dreadnought's hull. Not enough to kill it, not enough even to seriously wound it, but when a grenade detonated at the dreadnought's feet and managed to topple it over, less so because of the blast and more so because of the damage it did to the floor, the dreadnought was now submerged in the holy waters of the sacred balneary. This too alone would unlikely have done much, but there were flamethrower troopers in the room. After having initially been denied access to their flamethrowers, the Tarnith and the other Imperial Guard forces had been given permission to wield flamers after it became apparent that the traditions of the Civitas Beati hardly mattered if the entire thing fell to chaos. And they had contributed crucially to the defense, thus they were being honored with this private ceremony. God ordered the flamethrowers to begin firing into the pool, boiling the water. The boiling water then flooded in through the rent in the dreadnought's sarcophagus, boiling the long-dead Chaos Space Marine inside, to a final death this time. A final death that everyone seemingly was about to share. The city was falling. The main civilian spires fell to Innocenti later that day and in the early morning. The Magister had himself come down from orbit to start sacrificing civilians in the name of his patron deity. But what he had not gained control of just yet was the broadcasting system of the Civitas Beati. They had been running simple messages to shelter in place, and for the civilian populace to try and get away if they could. But now, the Saint recorded a brief message urging all faithful Imperial citizens to rise up and attack the invaders, stating that there was room enough for everyone in the Emperor's armies. Hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of civilians now began to rise up all across the city. Most of them had virtually no weaponry. Perhaps they had some scavenged PDF weapons, some dropped by the Blood Pact, maybe. Others wielded simple steel pipes, sticks, knives, whatever they could come across. They fell upon the invaders, and even if 10, 20, 30 of them died for every Blood Pact trooper they dragged down, the sheer numbers were beginning to tell. It would not in and of itself be anywhere near enough to swing the course of the battle, but it did drive Magister Innocenti mad with rage. He wanted the Saint, and he wanted her now. Enough so to throw caution to the wind and lead a personal massed assault against the heart of the remaining Imperial defenders. On a massive concord, he and his main force was met by the Saint's countercharge. The light Chaos armor that had been rushed out ahead of the Magister were blasted apart by Lifeguard tanks, slowly trundling back in reverse, taking enormous casualties as Lehman Russ after Russ was blasted apart by overwhelming, withering Stork tank fire. But they destroyed all of the enemy's lightly armored vehicles, forcing an infantry wave to crest up onto the promenade, led by Magister Innocenti. The moment it began to get into the open area, it was met by a massed counterattack of every reserve the Imperials could free up. The Tarnith, Civitas, Defenders, PDF, Militia, anything and everything was hurled at Innocenti, throwing back his defenders long enough for the Saint leading the charge to reach the Magister personally. It was a close-run thing, Ibrahim Gaunt almost losing his life to the Magister's own life warden, Bryn Milo barely saving him, and the Saint taking several deep, horrifying wounds from Magister Innocenti's blade, effortlessly tearing her golden power armor to shreds. But it was the Saint who emerged victorious from their conflict. Her gold-gleaming power sword decapitating the Chaos Magister, and then spilling his guts across the steps for all to see, killing him once and for all. This was, I believe now, the third or fourth time the Tarnith won a victory based on slaying the enemy general. This, of course, is the problem with cults of personality and basing one's entire command and control structure of individuals. When they die, a lot of problems ensue. Granted, the Imperials were beginning to make the same mistake, and they were very nearly undone by the same mistake as well. During the efforts to shut off the broadcast that was sending out the Saints' message, the Blood Pact had detonated vast quantities of explosives near the Civitas Beati's main power generation structures. This had indeed cut off the broadcast, but it had also severed power to practically the entirety of the Civitas. This unlocked Orgon Sorik's cell, which he had been thrown in to be kept safe until further interrogation could be arranged for him. Rushing out, he found members of the Tarnith First and Only, McCall and Colm Corbeck, informing them desperately that all of the assassins had not yet been slain. The Psykers were not there to kill the Saint, they were there to find somebody else to kill the Saint, a deep infiltrator, a plant, somebody within the Defenders who could move unseen and unspotted until it was time to strike. And Orgon Sorik had his name. Immediately, Colm Corbeck brought everyone he could get rushing to the Saint's side, finding her heavily wounded and surrounded by Ibrahim Gaunt and other ghosts, who were just barely in time to save her from Elijah Chu, who had been the perfect subject for Father Sin's mental manipulations. Elijah managed to slay Colonel Colm Corbeck in the ensuing confusion, almost managed to kill Ibrahim Gaunt, and would very well have gone on to kill the Saint herself, near mortally wounded by Magister Innocenti, if it were not for the intervention of a mad Plain Larkin, who had, ever since ex-Cardinal, known that it was Elijah Chu who had killed his best friend Bragg on Fantine many months previously. Ever since, the sniper had kept a keen eye on Elijah Chu, a fortuitous one as it turned out, as with this, the final danger to the Saint was in essence over. The war would continue on for weeks thereafter, the Blood Pact initially driven out of the city due to the twin mass psychic strikes, first of the death of their master Innocenti, and secondly from being assaulted from all quarters by screaming hordes of hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Blood Pact, however, rallied and began striking into the Civitas Beati again, nearly overrunning it for a second time, were it not for counterattacks led by the wounded but still walking Saint Sabbat, leading the hordes of pilgrims in overwhelming human wave tactics against the Chaos forces. Ironically, the roles had completely flipped. Normally, of course, it was Chaos that would lead hordes of fanatical, brainwashed civilians to throw themselves against the guns of the disciplined ranks of the Imperial Guard. Now, it was the Imperium, led by one of their saints, glowing brightly if somewhat diminished, leading hordes of screaming civilians to bravely throw themselves upon the guns of the Blood Pact. Our brave warriors, their savage barbarian fighters. And even then it was a close-run thing. Had the battle been down to just the Chaos forces and the Imperials, the Blood Pact's commanders, eventually managing to regain command and control over their headless host, would probably still have been able to prevail. But the Imperial reinforcements finally arrived. In the face of 5 capital ships and a carrier, the remaining Chaos warships either fled or were destroyed. And on the ground, the now beaten, battered, bruised, exhausted, undersupplied, and unsupported Blood Pact found themselves not only fighting the remnants of the Tarnith, the Lifeguard, the PDF, and the militia, not to mention hundreds of thousands of civilians, but also 3 fresh, reinforced heavy infantry regiments and a company of armor as well, carrying out the exact same trick upon them as the Chaos Forces had upon the Imperial defenders previously. Now it was the Imperials who had complete air superiority, who could deploy strike craft from their own carrier in orbit, who could rely on armored and infantry superiority and complete orbital command. And the Imperials, well, unlike the Chaos Forces, they weren't looking to take any prisoners, and so I imagined the occasional orbital bombardment would have had a role to play as well. It still took weeks and months to hunt down every last remaining sliver of Chaos resistance, but the Tarnith would not be there to see it. Having safeguarded the life of the Saint, their role in this drama was finally at long last over, and it had cost them dearly. The regiment had been massively reduced. A full platoon had actually been cut off outside of the final stronghold in the Civitas Beati, a mere half a kilometer from reaching the closing gates that Ibrahim Gaunt himself had ordered closed, fearing the Blood Pact might be storming in any moment. The regiment had also lost its second in command, the much beloved Colm Corbeck, who would, at least as one final little mercy, be buried in a gnarlwood coffin, as one of the last final remaining storage areas of gnarlwood, the prime premier export of Tarnith in ages long past, was located right here on Herodor. Colm Corbeck might never see Tarnith again, and he might never see the world that Gaunt was perhaps one day going to claim for the Tarnith, but at least his final resting place would remind him forevermore of home, buried as a hero and as a soldier of the God Emperor who had saved one of his most luminescent servants. No Imperial citizen could ever ask for any greater honor than that, and the love of his comrades in arms, as Colonel Colm Corbeck would be sorely missed by the Tarnith first and only forevermore. And with that, once more I bid you all adieu as we wrap up the battle for Herodor, a planet that had played a role of far vaster strategic significance than anyone could ever have imagined to contribute to such a backwater planet. It had seen the death of a Chaos Magister, and it had blunted an enormous Chaos force, preventing it from driving deeper into War Master Makaroth's exposed flank. All, of course, as the Saint herself had intended. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.